So I'm Sam Graves, and I will be interviewing my grandfather, Peter Sterling, about his participation in the freedom rides during the Civil Rights Movement. So to start it off, I'm just gonna ask, can you tell me about your childhood? Like, where did you grow up? How you were raised? Things like that.
Well, I was born in 1940 in New York City. I lived for the first 8 years in Queens, which is a borough of New York City, and then we moved to a suburb of New York, the northern suburb, Rye, New York, a small town, and that's where I went to elementary and high school.
Okay, so like, how did your parents raise you? Like, what were their beliefs and what did they educate you on and stuff like that?
Well, my parents were members at that time of the American Communist Party, which was a very, speaks for itself. And so their values were favoring the workers and various oppressed people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we were raised to value.
I see. So did they talk to you about racism at the time and things like that? Or?
Oh yes, they certainly did. They were both members of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Okay. Wow.
And we lived in a pretty upper class, white, Republican, Protestant community, but the town next door was named Portchester, and it's a working class community, and it had a very large black ghetto, a poor ghetto. And my father, Philip Sterling, worked in the NAACP trying to improve housing in that community.
Okay. Wow. So and so after your childhood, so where did you go to college, and talk to me about your education?
Well, I went to high school in Rye, I was in a small high school which had a graduating class of a little over 100 kids. And during that period, although there was only a few African Americans in that class, I was a member, when I was in high school, of the youth group of the NAACP. Most of the membership was in Portchester, so I was involved in civil rights activity before I left high school. In fact, I remember hearing from the adult leader of the NAACP youth group about the Martin Luther King's leading of the bus boycott in Montgomery. So this was a very early introduction to the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm. And so during that time, what was life like for colored people at the time?
Well, it was it was pretty bad. I mean, there were very few positions that African Americans, jobs that they could get. For example, in the town I grew up, there was a job of postman, but most people had jobs that were cleaning or doing service jobs for white people. And when I moved to, and there was segregation of housing, both in Rye, where I grew up, and in neighboring Portchester. So most of the black people were forced to live in crummy areas and go to crummy, basically segregated schools.
So did you notice a lot of the poor treatment, as a high schooler? And
Well, I did, because I was raised to notice. Most of the white kids weren't aware of this, but in our family, this was a major preoccupation.
And how did it make you feel, segregation?
Well, I was it was part of the family, essentially religion and motivation to oppose the racism. And my mother, when I was a couple of years after I graduated from high school, my mother helped a black family who were friends of theirs to obtain an apartment in a segregated all white garden, sort of like a condo.
Mm-hmm.
And she signed the lease pretending it was for her, and then she turned it over to this black family, and all hell broke loose basically in the town. And this is at the time I was also involved in Freedom Rides, and the two combined activities earned us the right to have some people who were never identified burn a cross on our lawn, just like the Ku Klux.
Wow. So, leading more into the time during your arrest, like, what was your job at the time, like, closer to?
I was a student. I mean, I was a student at
Okay.
I went to Cornell University, and I was in my third year at Cornell in May, and pretty much around this time is when the Freedom Rides reached the buses that were going south with integrated buses reached Montgomery, Alabama, and they were attacked, and the bus was burned, and people were injured and really almost died, almost burned to death. And the image of this burning bus was published in the New York Times and spread around, and that's, of course, we were all aware of this, and then a few days later, people began to call for a massive movement of integrated riders to go converge on Mississippi. And so with this image in mind, and some of my friends, most of whom were older, a little bit older, they were graduate students, said, well, let's go. You know? And this was just around exam time and at Cornell. And so I thought, so some people didn't want to go, but I thought, oh, well, we've got to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So I went around to my professors and asked them if they would give me, as a final grade, the grade I'd earned so far, and just let me forget the exam. And 4 out of 5 said yes.
Mm.
So we hopped up, we took a car, 5 or 6 of us, and drove from Ithaca, New York, with a New York license plate, which is a little tricky to drive in the South with a New York license plate, toward Mississippi.
Okay. Huh. And I know that a lot of Freedom Riders were recruited by the Congress of Racial Equality. Were you, and like, did you have any like relations with the Congress of?
Well, yes. The Freedom Rides were being organized initially by the Congress of Racial Equality, but also by this time the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committees, known as SNCC, which is in Nashville, was also sending people in buses.
Mm-hmm.
And that included, for example, John Lewis, who's now a congressman and who's been a tremendous civil rights leader for many years. And he and his group began to organize students to go to Mississippi. So the Congress, so when we left Ithaca, we drove down through Kentucky, we drove through Tennessee, Alabama, and one interesting story was when we got to a certain small town in Alabama, there was 4 or 5 of us, and a Sunday afternoon, it was a warm spring Sunday afternoon, and we stopped to visit the aunt of one of the young men who was with, and when the aunt saw my friend Charles Haney, she burst into tears because she knew where we were going. She just knew intuitively where we were going. She thought, oh, this is going to be so much trouble. So she was upset. But our goal was to get to New Orleans, because New Orleans was a center from which CORE Congress of Racial Equality was organizing and training people to go to Jackson, Mississippi. And Jackson was the focus, to fill the jails in Jackson and then in Mississippi. So CORE didn't recruit us. We recruited CORE. So we arrived in Jackson, Mississippi. Well, I can tell one other story. We had one of our companions was from Texas, and he had this real broad Texas accent. And we decided that once we crossed the border into Mississippi with a New York license plate, we knew we would get stopped by police. Mm-hmm. And soon as we crossed the border, we got stopped. But this Texan was driving, and he just said to the cop, they said, "Where are you all going? You know, are you going to make trouble?" And in this case, he said, "No, we're just going to see my mom and dad down in Galveston, and we're just moseying along." And so they let us go. So we made it into New Orleans, fairly late in the evening on a Sunday evening, and we didn't know where to go. So it took an hour or so to call around to various churches and so on to find out who, because CORE was like an underground organization. It was like the French resistance in World War II. And so after a while, we got in touch with the CORE people in the black community, and they took us in and fed us dinner. And in fact, one of the things I remember was that the young woman from CORE who was taking us in said, "Well, we want to feed you dinner, but is it okay to take you to a black restaurant?" And we thought, well, of course. But that was what it was like. It was illegal for black and white people to live together or to stay overnight in the same place. So when we walked into this black restaurant at like 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, the people had, they'd been in church all day and so on, and we were these young white men, but they all knew why we were there. And they treated us very well.
And so you were, people of CORE welcomed you, like everyone was happy.
CORE welcomed us. We were fed well. We were greeted warmly. We spent the night with one of the families who was CORE organizers, and the next day we spent being trained in nonviolent methods. So we were reminded that if we got attacked, we weren't to fight back. We were to curl up in a ball and protect our heads and try to protect our bodies, but not to respond. And so we had a good day of training. And at the end of the day, we said, okay, well, tomorrow we're leaving, but do you want, you could get hurt, you could get beaten up, you could die. Is anybody, are you ready to go? We all raised our hands and said yes, although I realized there's a photograph of this group, and it was on the AP, the Associated Press wire, and I looked at this photograph of our group, everybody raising their hands, but I realized that there's one of those guys that didn't go, and I think he wasn't in the group the next day, and I think he just thought maybe you could skip this.
So did you have sort of like a sense of fear in you, like of being attacked or something like that?
Well, it was very abstract. I mean, we knew, we knew that was a possibility. But what we didn't take a lot of people, buses had been attacked. But interestingly, by this time, this was Memorial Day weekend, and by this time the FBI under Robert Kennedy had realized, this isn't looking good for the U.S. Abroad, and maybe we don't want to get more people killed and burned, bus burned. So the FBI warned CORE not to send people. They said there's a mob waiting on the Mississippi line to attack the bus. So they told us to take a train. So early in the morning, on this day we left, I forget which day, we went to the train station in New Orleans, all bought tickets, and it was an integrated group, black and white, men and women, and we bought a train ticket for Jackson, and we got on the train. And I mean, we had taken steps. For example, I had a necktie. We all had neckties, but we were told to cut the necktie with a little razor so that if someone tried to choke us with it, it would break. And one of my professors had warned us. He said, if you're going to get stomped, get an athletic supporter, which is aluminum. And so we had done that. So we had our crotches protected and our necks protected. And we figured, okay. I think I had that until we left Philadelphia. I mean, I had it in my top drawer and I finally threw it out. So I think we were anxious, but not terrified. And of course, when we got off the train as a group, the plan was to ask for the lunch, you know, the cafeteria or whatever it was, the lunch counter in the train station. But by this time, there was so much publicity and so much interest in this that when we got off the train, there was a mob of police and there was a mob of reporters. And the police were very anxious to just grab us and get us out of there before there was any trouble. So as we asked around, where's the lunch counter, the police said, you know, you're under arrest, blah, blah, blah. And they put us in a paddy wagon and took us off. So we were really not, we weren't at that point in much danger.
I see. So can you tell me about like the day of your like trip on the train?
Well, it was, I don't know, it must be a few hours trip. And I guess we were, you know, a little anxious and excited. I sat next to a young woman she was married at the time, and her husband was on the trip too, and the two of them were from South Carolina, and they had been involved in a number of sit-ins, and they'd been in jail a bunch of times in South Carolina, so they were very good people, and it was quite interesting and inspiring for us to meet these black students from the South who were really, you know, we weren't at that much risk, but they were in constant risk. Arrested and beaten and all kinds of stuff. And I've still been in touch with her over the years, actually.
So, so you sat next to her, and then did police come on the? Were you arrested on the train?
No. We got down from the train, stopped in Jackson. We got down off the train, and actually, there's some photograph of me getting off the video, getting off the train in that PBS series.
Oh.
And there's an interview. Actually, what I had forgotten was that we were interviewed on the train by some reporter, and she was interviewed, and then I was interviewed. There's this clip at the end of the PBS. In fact, I have a copy if you want to see it. Have you seen it?
I don't think so.
So we'd already been interviewed, and we were ready, and we were just shipped off to jail, and we were singing, you know, freedom songs and so on.
Okay. So how did like the police treat you in the jail? Were they racist, or were they just?
Well, they were pretty. They behaved well. I mean, they photographed. We got a mug shot, and I think you've seen my mug shot.
Yeah.
And we were put into jail, but it was segregated. We were the white kids were in one place, and the black kids were in another. And and when we went to court, which was interesting, in the afternoon, we were taken to court to be arraigned by this in front of this judge. And the judge, we had a lawyer who had been hired, I guess, by CORE, and he was a brave man because he was a black lawyer, and he was you know, in great total constant danger and of being murdered, basically. And he was our defense counsel, and of course the white judge, you know, called him by his first name and treated him like he was, you know, nothing. And so we were asked to, you know, I guess to plead, and we said we were innocent, but we were immediately declared guilty and sentenced to either I don't know, 67 days in jail or something, and $200 or $200 fine. And then we were put back in the cell.
I see. So after you were released from, so did you go to jail or did you pay the fine?
Well, I stayed a while, but you know, I was also scheduled to marry your grandmother in not too long, and she wasn't too happy that I had done this, of course. And nor was her mother, her mother.
Oh, yeah.
At all happy. And of course, I'm sure my parents were worried about it, but on the other hand, they had sort of raised me to do this, so they really couldn't say no. And my grandfather, Grandma Dot's father, was a lawyer, and I think when he first heard about it, he was embarrassed about having a family member in jail. It seemed like a shameful thing. But then, as he learned more about it, he realized that this is probably a good thing to have done.
Interesting. So, after you got out of jail, did you do anything else to help the civil rights movement?
Yeah, so I got out of jail because a professor of mine at Cornell, a very fine man named Howard Schneiderman, actually paid the fine and helped me. I had been working for him, and he was very helpful to me. Yeah, I stayed working for CORE. So I went to school for a year in New York City, and then I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, when I was in the school, Western Reserve University, where I got my PhD, and I continued working with CORE there on fair housing. I taught in freedom schools. I remained active in civil rights pretty much until the Vietnam War sort of needed my attention more. And also, at that time in the late '60s, the black kids from SNCC began to feel that they didn't want any more help from white kids, and they sort of they segregated the civil rights movement for themselves. They wanted to control it themselves, which went on for a period. So I moved from focusing on civil rights to working against the Vietnam War.
And what did you do against? How did you work?
Yeah, well, that went on for 10 years, a dozen years. I taught in teach-ins against the war. I collected signatures on petitions against the war. I marched on Washington. One of my friends, who you've met, Price Peterson.
Oh, yeah.
He remembers that when I would give a lecture when I was an assistant professor in the late '60s, early '70s, I sometimes began a lecture by handing around a petition for students to sign and faculty to sign to send to Washington. And he tells this story now as though like, oh my God, so look at what Sterling was doing, driving everybody crazy. But I think he, in retrospect, he thought it was crazy at the time, but I think in retrospect he actually respects it.
Mm-hmm. So, were there any repercussions from taking part in the civil rights movement? Like, did you get harassed or?
Well, I mean, our family did get this cross burned on,
right.
But no, I mean, personally, no, I never really suffered any. I did find out that in the maybe after the Freedom of Information Act was passed, it was possible to get your file from the FBI and to see what was in it. And one of the things I learned, first of all, the person with the biggest file in the family was Grandma Dot. And she had a big, thick file, and a lot of stuff was crossed out and stuff like that. My file was sort of respectable at that time. But what I learned was that in 1958, when I went to college, my first year in college, and I wrote a letter to the student newspaper saying, I don't think it's a good idea to drop radioactive bombs in the air. Somebody had cut out my letter to the student newspaper and sent it into the FBI file.
Wow.
When I went to a meeting about this, somebody reported to the FBI that I had gone to this meeting. And so there was a system in the late 50s, after the McCarthy period was sort of over, where the FBI was still collecting information on what they considered left political activities. So, and that continued certainly on. I mean, I had a CIA file also of marches I went on and petitions I signed up into maybe into the late 70s. So I didn't suffer, my job didn't suffer from it, but it was an issue of, and we, so now when people worry about all the data collection from the telephone, I think, well, we were raised not to say anything on telephone because we knew our phone was tapped and our mail was open, and so there was a very long-term, systematic spying, basically, on citizens for their political activities.
So, did your decisions to take part in like the freedom rides, the civil rights movement, like affect decisions later on in your life?
Well, I don't think those. I think the decisions in these areas, I continued basically on the same line throughout my life. In our family, we were just raised to pay attention to trying to make the country behave better toward everybody, and I think I continued that pretty much throughout my life. Yeah. And sometimes, well, there's one famous example which would have been in the I know when it was 1993, so already I'm in my 50s, where a white young professor in the University of Pennsylvania was giving a lecture about, he was a neurologist, and he was giving a lecture about talking about his patients, and who were obviously poor black people from West Philadelphia, and he was making fun of them, and I was sitting in the back, and he went on just too far. And I got furious, and I stood up in the back, and I stopped him. And I said, you know, are we any better than these people? And I don't think so. And you shouldn't be talking like that. And he didn't know who I was, but he said, well, if you don't like it, you can leave. You can get out. And I said, no, this is my course. I'm a professor in this course, and you have to stop this. Well, all hell broke loose because the black students who had been sitting and taking this and really they weren't so quick to fight back, but once I had sort of stimulated this, they raised hell, they walked out, and the whole place broke up in pandemonium. And I would say I was sort of a little bit upset with myself because I had become so angry and somewhat out of control. On the other hand, looking back over many years, I mean, if I hadn't been, I would just let him go on if I'd been calm. And people said, well, you should have talked to him later and not interrupted the lecture. And I thought, well, no, I mean, this is a demonstration to 150 medical students on this topic, and so I did this. And one of the consequences was that the faculty, not one faculty member ever came to me and said, you know, you did the right thing. A few of my friends outside of the medical school did, but not one of the faculty members in my department defended me or came to, be sympathetic. And 6 months later, when it was time to reorganize the course, I was not invited back. And this was a course that I had organized and invented, basically. So, and of course, by that time, I really no longer wanted to teach in it. So, in effect, it was sort of like, you know, the Brer Rabbit and the Briar Patch, you know, please don't throw me into the Briar Patch. So I got fired from this course, which I really hated by that time. So it was hard.
So is there anything else you'd like to say about your participation in?
Well, I think that looking back, and people say, well, sometimes you hear people say, well, nothing's changed, because, with all the fracas about, I mean, the police are still shooting young black men and targeting them in ways that, really are unfortunate. And this still needs attention. But I think anybody who says nothing has changed is just not paying attention. When we started, black people couldn't get jobs. They weren't seen on TV. If they were on TV, they were sweeping the floor. It was just, they weren't, when I came to the University of Pennsylvania in 1969, there were no black faculty. There were no black students. There were maybe 2 black students at Cornell. The country really has changed, and the whole expectations that people have of equality and equal treatment have changed for the better. And so I think it was something there were a lot of reasons why this had to happen, but I think the people working the civil rights movement were very important in this. And I would say one other thing, that when a few years ago, there was a 50th reunion in Mississippi of the Freedom Riders, and a book has come out. Well, I watched the PBS 2-hour special on it, but there was a book that's come out on the Freedom Riders, and I read it at the time. And what I hadn't realized, I mean, I was sort of a foot soldier in this movement. You needed bodies to go here. I did it. You needed people to teach freedom in school. I did that. But the Freedom Rides, organized by CORE, were really based on an understanding of the Supreme Court decisions that had been made in the late 40s that would basically needed to be tested. And so the lawyers for CORE and the NAACP thought about what would be the best way to test it, who to put on that first bus. I mean, they put some really good people on that bus. I mean, John Lewis was just an incredible individual leader. And so one of the things I learned now, in retrospect, is the intellectual, the attention and thought that went in, and the planning that went into organizing the civil rights movement, and the brilliance of the people who organized, for example, the march, the 1963 March on Washington, and the brilliance of men like Martin Luther King. But Martin Luther King was an incredible orator and thinker, but John Lewis was just a moral force. He got his head broken so many times, and he still to this day is in Congress doing really great things. So I guess the civil rights movement brought out a lot of really good things about wonderful Americans who would have been lost in just sweeping floors. And the country is a lot better today in all these respects.
Okay.
Cut.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Shake your hand.
So have you